I'm simply chairing and sort of fielding questions which we hope that you will come up with and ask and suggest and talk about. But I'm going to introduce nobody. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. For those of you who've never heard of me, Gerry Cohen, I'm the head of RE at a school in Cricklewood, come by way of a number of different schools over the years, and I've been involved in mainly teaching Christianity, Islam and some Judaism in secondary schools, with bits and pieces of other. But I've also been involved for many years in the interfaith work, in getting together with people mainly from Christianity and Islam, Judaism, outside of schools, and getting us to see our diversity, our difference and our similarities, and helping us to actually realise that we do have similarities, but we do need to keep our individuality. And whilst some people have said, you know, when you've got two Jews, you've got three opinions, I don't agree. I think there's a lot more than that. So I hope that what we'll find today, opportunity for discussion. I will mention a few bits and pieces from time to time, but it'll be down to you, really, because you've come to find out and you will have questions, and we'd like to know what those questions are. And if we can't answer them immediately, it's not because we're brain dead. It just simply means that we would like to come back to you and give you the opportunity to have a more in-depth question answered, and we're happy to do that at other times. So I'm going to start, Debbie. Do you want to? And then move across.
I'm Debbie. I've been teaching for many years now. I teach. At the moment, I'm teaching in Dulwich. I'm teaching in an academic, independent, selective school, which I've been teaching for 23 years now. I am Jewish. I was born Jewish. I was born into the Orthodox tradition. I am not a religious Jew. I would put myself very, very much at the secular end of that spectrum. I teach Orthodox Judaism as a spectrum, and the girls that I teach are very used to me flinging my arms aside and talking about this spectrum, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. I would put Haredi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, right at this end of the spectrum. I would put Jews who are interestingly Orthodox. They would put on their census that they were Jewish, but they wouldn't practice a thing deliberately. They're sort of at the very secular end, and I sort of put myself around about here on that scale. But I'm a practicing Jew in the sense that I do go to synagogue when I go to a house of worship, but it's not very frequent. I don't keep very much, but I feel if I had to define myself in terms of if I had to nail my colours to a mast and say, are you British or are you Jewish? Which of course I'm both. Both are complementary, but if I had to choose between them, I'm afraid I would say I'm Jewish. That's for
Why
me.
be afraid?
I would say so. That would be sort of where I'm coming from. So theologically, I'm a bit patchy.
Brilliant. If you think of, there's an image that we can't show up there, but if you think of our traditional menorah, and you think of all the different branches that make that up, think about Judaism as often being rather like that. There are people from different ends of the spectrum, but they're all part of what makes us that thing which we call Judaism. Thanks.
I'm Anne Krisman, and I belong to a Reform synagogue, but I also belong to a liberal synagogue as well, which is unusual because I was made an honorary member of Kent Liberal Synagogue because I do a lot of work within schools for the Kent Liberal Jewish community. So they said, would you like to be an honorary member? So I said, okay. So I sort of cross over to synagogues, really. And my parents were Orthodox, but when I was 11, I had friends who were in Reform, and I went to Reform synagogue, and it was like amazing because suddenly I could understand what was going on in the synagogue. It was mainly in English. Women and men were sitting together, and it just suddenly appealed to me. So I became a member of Reform Synagogue. And I think we're always defining ourselves, explaining ourselves. I think when you're Jewish, you have to kind of explain yourself, your views on kashrut, what you eat, what you don't eat, why. I think we're always defining who we are and what we are. So I would probably like to go to a synagogue more, but because I'm now living in Kent, I don't have a synagogue near me at all, and even the liberal synagogue that I'm part of is about an hour to get to. So it isn't easy for me to go to a synagogue, and I would love to go to a synagogue more than I do, but I still consider myself to be really firmly culturally Jewish. Like Gerry, I've been involved with interfaith work all over my teaching career, especially as I've taught lots of children from different faiths. And I also, with the Three Faiths Forum, I went to Israel with the Three Faiths Forum 2 years ago, and that was a brilliant experience. Yeah.
Hi, do I need to move this closer to me, or is it fine? Cool. My name's Abigail Kay. I'm not a teacher. I work for a charity called the Three Faiths Forum, which I imagine many of you will have come across, and I volunteer with them as well. To carry on what's already been said, we love to define ourselves and put ourselves on the spectrum of where we are in Judaism. I grew up as an observant Orthodox Jew without any spirituality. We had the religion, we didn't have the spiritual side, and we did things because we did things, not because there was any feeling behind it. I left that behind a few years ago and went to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where I now would refer to myself as a once-a-year Jew, which to many people means that you go to synagogue on the Day of Atonement, but for me means I go to synagogue on the anniversary of my mum's death, and that is the only time I go to synagogue. People ask me what type of Jew I am, and the best way that I find to identify with the Jewish community is through LGBT things, so I kind of consider myself an LGBT Jew rather than a denominational Jew. And that's how I connect most to Jewish practice and Jewish identity. I wouldn't call myself a cultural Jew because I don't practice anything, but I would think of myself as a historical Jew. I identify with the history behind Judaism and the history of my family and the history of my people, but I don't see that being in my current life.
And what you might find as we have just sort of introduced ourselves is that we do have a diversity within our belief and our understanding of what we consider to be Jewish. And you'll notice that we don't have any Orthodox rabbis here today. It's Saturday. Why would they? And theoretically you might say, well, why would we be here? And you'll find this amongst Jewish people, that there are some who are regular observers going to synagogue, just the same as you would find many other faiths. I grew up in the liberal or progressive synagogue where men and women sit together, and I found as I grew into my faith, if you like, more and more, I became more interested in the more traditional ways, the more observant ways. On the other hand, we did grow up with the feeling that if Dad ever wrote his memoir, it would be called Hide the Bacon, Grandma's Coming. And there, in a sense, you get the difficulty of being in a social and cultural situation, calling yourself a Jewish person, and also having the identity of where you're living. North London, we had a Christmas tree, but it was silver, so it wasn't really a Christmas tree. But we also gave Hanukkah presents, and you occasionally find that. Within my own family life of being married, my wife and I, we take a more orthodox, but not fully orthodox. So we go to a more orthodox form of shul, where men and women sit separately. most of the prayers are in Hebrew. But that doesn't stop me enjoying going to other forms of synagogue and service and relating to the other branches. What I'm hoping that we'll do for a few moments is to ask you to just spend a couple of minutes, just as you're so far spread all over the place, is to actually tell someone else what you would like to know about Judaism, so that you will then have a question to ask us. Because we're teachers and we expect you to do stuff. So if you do that, that would be great, and then we'll see what you come. You may already have something in mind that you want to ask, but if not, talk to each other and tell each other what you would like to know. And then you might find that you have similar thoughts. So if we just pause what we're doing, and it's down to you. And as they say, we're back in the room. So, we know you've got questions because we know that you think that we know things. So we're hoping that what we're going to be doing today will be useful. Just some clues about good questions. Why does? What if? How would you? Could you explain? Things like that tend to be the things that get fired at us. So, ready, aim, and fire. Thank you. Hi.
One of the I went to the session before the panel discussion, and Alan asked each of the members of the panel to actually give a word or a sort of one concept that they felt encapsulated their belief in Islam. And I was wondering whether you might be able to do the same for us. And I suppose I'm interested. I'm a teacher, educator now, as well as having been an RE teacher for years, and I often find that the way into lessons is to kind of pick on a concept that I can, drive home to the students, and that be my main focus for my planning and the assessing.
Brilliant.
So I was wondering if you might be able to do this.
Okay. That would be good. That's why you're on the panel.
I think I'd probably go back to what I said at the beginning of either historical or LGBT as the ways that I relate to Judaism.
Brilliant. Thanks.
I'd say loving kindness, because we see God as a God of loving kindness, that everything we do should be to support loving kindness. So things like charity, care for the sick, care for the elderly, even creating a damaged world, which is quite a big concept, I think, in Reform Judaism, repair of a damaged world. Chesed would go into that as well. So for me, loving kindness is really important, because it's about how we relate to people today. So it isn't about historical Judaism that isn't relevant. It's about how we can make Judaism relevant today by doing acts of loving kindness, by making the world a better place. Whether it is through our relationships with people, whether it's with our relationships with other faiths, seeking to understand others, seeking equal rights for people who are LGBT, LGBT. That is really important for me.
What you also find when you think about chesed and about loving kindness comes the big questions that your students are bound to be asking and bound to be looking at, which are things like, if God is chesed, if he is loving kindness, you get the question of suffering, which comes up in your specs, comes up so often, and then you look at other aspects of the God of that particular faith, and then you can move on from there. That's a good starting point there. Debbie, do you have something?
I think I would say family. And then I would say history. I think that family is the one constant in Judaism. And I think that the history, and certainly the weight of history that I feel, as the legacy that I have inherited, is the enormous rather miserable weight of history. Judaism is a rather exciting sociological anomaly, because really we shouldn't exist. We shouldn't exist. We're the only religion current religion that has existed for 2,000 years without any homeland whatsoever, without having any access to any homeland whatsoever. And we shouldn't exist, because we should have just diluted straight out, right out of the faith after 2,000 years. So we are a sociological anomaly, and there's something of a miracle in that. And I think that the reason for that is because of the family, because of what goes on in the family. And that might be extremely, and of course, keeping the customs in the family, keeping kashrut, having mezuzahs on the door, the festivals, having a Seder meal at Pesach, and so on. That's an enormous part of that. But for people like me who are not very strong on ritual and on practice in that kind of way, somehow my children feel absolutely entirely Jewish, without actually knowing a huge amount about Judaism at all. I mean, my older daughter, to my horror, still refers to when she had her bar mitzvah, which she never had. She had a bat chayil, but our level of practice is such that she can't really distinguish. But she would never ever be able to. It's as integral to who she is, being Jewish, as it is to who I am, and so somehow something is passed on, which is very, very difficult, I think, to explain, to quantify, but it's there in the atmosphere of the home, in the sort of, in that fifth commandment that says honour your parents, even if your parents aren't specifically clear about what it is you should be honouring. And that there is something in the Shema that says, teach these words to your children. And you sort of do, but in a bizarre psychological way that isn't necessarily getting your children to say their prayers at night or to keep milk products away from meat products. There's something in the zeitgeist, in the atmosphere of the home, that is absolutely quintessentially and tangibly Jewish. I'll tell you actually what I think is a perfect example of this, which some of you might know. I have howled with laughter watching Friday Night Dinner. I don't know if any of you have done likewise. Now, what I so love about watching that programme is that it is fairly, give or take one or two of the characters that I'm not too fond of, but it is quintessentially Jewish, without there being much going on there that's Jewish at all. I mean, for a Friday night dinner, you never see the Shabbat candles, you never see the challah, you never see... but what you see is somehow in that family dynamic is quintessentially Jewish. Now, how are you going to teach that to your kids? I haven't a clue. Except show them Friday night dinner, I guess. But there is something in the family, because, of course, Jews have never had the luxury of being able to say, we've always had synagogues to go to. If you look at some of the synagogues in this country, they're cathedral synagogues, because it was Jews 200 years ago saying, look how normal we are. You have your churches, we have our synagogues, they're the same, You have your priests, we have our rabbis, same. But of course, throughout Jewish history, Jews have never been able to rely on being able to have synagogues. But they've had their families, even in dire conditions of pogrom, of anti-Semitism, of being victimised. They still had their families, and within that family, somehow, over 2,000 years of exile, Judaism is still here, and it's still strong, and it's still as alive as ever. So something happens in that family. So that's my word, family.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that, actually? Developing on from that, I would say the kind of flip side to that on the macro is community, because so much of Judaism is focused around doing things as a community. There are prayers that can only be said when you're part of a community. There are elements of practice which rely on other people doing things for you or doing things with you or you doing things for other people. There's so much that's centered around. Judaism can never be an individual religion. You can't be a Jew by yourself.
No, that's right. That's right.
I mean, I can because I don't practice anything. But if you practice, you can't be a Jew by yourself. You have to have some kind of community around you.
As we said in the session about marriage and mourning, those two things that take place in many people's lives are done with others around us. We need the witnesses to say, yes, we will help these people to stay together and to continue their marriage. And when it comes to mourning, we have that situation where we are in such a situation that we feel we can't get on with the daily life of the washing and the cleaning, but somebody else will come and help us. They'll bring the food, they'll bring those things. So it's very much both things. You notice how I'm not worried about this panel about doing things because you asked for 4 words. That's Judaism.
It goes back to that first image of the outstretched arms, and it's to do with possibly teaching. A friend wrote a summary for GCSE textbook, and she said to me, show that to your rabbi friend. So I showed it to my rabbi friend, and he said, it's great, she's not put a foot wrong. He says, but it looks like a Martian landed in Golders Green and wrote down what they saw.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And because he's from a more reformed tradition,
Yes.
I felt that wasn't quite capturing
Okay.
Judaism as it's lived in our particularly in the UK. But myself and Nathan were wondering, how would we tell the difference? A colleague there made the distinction between reformed and liberal. How would we tell the difference between, if you like, that side of things? And kind of get a sense of what the difference between an ultra-orthodox and an orthodox would be. But in trying to teach a difference on the other side of that spectrum, what would that look like? How would I tell the difference between a reformed wedding and a liberal wedding and an orthodox wedding?
All right. Anybody want to start before I do something?
I think if you're talking about a wedding, people would be sitting together, the congregation would be sitting together. That's usually a good sign of the difference between Orthodox and Reform, wouldn't you say? So they would, in Orthodox synagogues, men and women are separate. You would have more English in a service if you go to a Reform service. So I think the emphasis would be on everyone understanding, possibly. You may have a female rabbi if you go to Reform synagogue. Women would be more involved with the service, so they'd actually be reading from the Torah, which wouldn't happen in an Orthodox service. Have I missed anything else out?
No, I think that I think it would be. I take your point. I think it'd be actually very difficult to actually for me to if you put me without knowing into 2 different environments and said which of this is liberal and which of this is reform.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily know unless there was something very specific about the service that enabled me to know.
Sometimes the rabbis cross over, so we do have rabbis from
Reform and
Reform
liberal.
who also go into liberal. So it isn't that
I think
sharp a divide.
my understanding of liberal is that is really in things that are behind the scenes, like the acceptability. So, for example, a liberal shul will, and I think has for a long time, accepted patrilineage as well as matrilineage So that's something that you wouldn't be able to see, but it's it's a sort of. It's behind the scenes. It's their rationale. This is a problem, and this is something that when we divide up in, what I think is very important to understand, and this is coming to what Abigail was saying about community, is that we are a community in decline. That ironically, because because of multiculturalism. And because of the world's horror with Nazism, we've become so welcomed into society since the 1960s that we've almost scored an own goal against ourselves, and we're marrying out at the rate of knots. So we are a community in decline. And part of the big problem between these different sort of groups or denominations, if you like, within Judaism, is that because there are so few of us, our kids tend to mix in these big youth groups and youth movements to a large degree together. So that there are Reform youth groups and there are Orthodox youth groups, but on the whole, Reform groups are very happy for Orthodox kids to go to them. And therein we have a problem. And here is a problem within Judaism, is who is a Jew. Because essentially this issue of either the majority only accepting matrilineage, liberal accepting patrilineage also, the issue of conversion, because conversion within, and my kids always say to me, because when I'm teaching Judaism, we talk about tracing our line back to Abraham, supposedly. They say, but then can you not convert? And the answer is, well, yes, you can, but it's much easier to do so through liberal and reform, because they essentially make the best of a rather bad situation. And the bad situation is that part of living in a multicultural environment and wanting very much to fit into that, unless you're ultra-Orthodox, wanting to be British people, wanting to be recognised by our Britishness as much as by our Jewishness, and for some more, that essentially the problem with that is that we've got these kids mixing together. You have the liberal and the Reform. They make the best of a bad situation by making conversion easier, because they recognise that Jewish people are going to fall in love with non-Jewish people. And making the best of a bad situation is not doing what happened in the past, and which the Orthodox to some extent still do, which is to ostracise the couple. But they welcome the Reform or the Liberal will welcome the non-Jewish partner and make much more in an involved way rather than just an observational way. They'll make conversion easier. It's not as difficult to convert. And so the problem is that when the kids do all mix together in this youth group and that youth group, then you'll still possibly come up with a problem if this Jewish kid falls in love with that Jewish kid and they want to marry and they want to forge a future together, but is this one Jewish? Because they're progressive Jewish. They might have come from they might be the child of a converted mother that was converted or liberal or reformed. You see, but essentially that is not acceptable within Orthodoxy, and these are some of the warts, I'm afraid. That Jewish law, halakha, has not entirely managed to sort out. And
sorry.
No, I think I was just going to say that in this modern day, you see, it was a very interesting thing that's happened in recent years, which is when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s, we never talked about God. We just never did. We just never did. We knew who we were because of who we were born, how we were born, how we were brought up, this quintessential Jewishness that went on in the home. But we spent our Friday nights arguing and not talking about God. We didn't talk about theology. We never had to say, I believe in anything. We still don't. The Shema, which is, if you like, the closest we get to a statement of faith, you are not required to say, I believe. You are told, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So we never really talked about God. But what's happened more and more, which has changed, and this is how I think society's changed, and I think this has affected our society as a whole in Britain, is that one way and another, people are talking about God far more than they ever did. And so within Judaism, we're having a sort of polarising effect, where you're getting people becoming more secular, possibly like Abigail, more and more secular, but because the God talk is so much more prominent than ever it was. I mean, I have loads of friends who are very religious Jewish atheists. Seriously. They keep kosher, they keep kashrut, they wouldn't ever dream of not having kosher food. They go to the synagogue, maybe not every Shabbat, but they go regularly. But if they said to it, do you believe in God? They have not really, but many Jews don't think about God. You know, they don't actually think about the God issues. But these days, God is so much in the zeitgeist, probably because of 9/11, probably because of Richard Dawkins, but God is high on the list. So for example, what's his socks, when he became Miliband, when he became head of the Labour Party, within an hour he declared that he wasn't a theist. So God talk is much more on the agenda. And with Judaism, it seems to me that instead of this spectrum, which I did start out with, has actually become like trumpet-ended. So that you end up with a lot more, the Jewish word, the Yiddish word is from religious Jews. And you end up, on the other hand, with sort of a much narrower middle band, and then it starts to trumpet out at the other end, where you have many secular Jews. Whereas in my day, you accepted who you were, and you just got on with living. Does that make
Sounds like the opening of Fiddler on the Roof.
I know,
when Tevye says, everybody knows who he is and what God expects of him.
That's right.
And what's interesting is when we're trying to work out what type of synagogue or what type of Jew you are, and we measure you by, do you eat bacon? Often, seldom, never. That kind of thing. But also, in your synagogue, do you understand what's going on? Are they speaking the English language or the French language or the Spanish language, depending on what country you're in, as well as the Hebrew?
And Aramaic. Don't forget Aramaic.
Of course. Now, in 1960, the Rabbinic Assembly of America decided to relax halakha law on driving on the Shabbat and the use of electronic appliances. This is way before we all had our phones. And the thinking was, if you are going to get to synagogue by breaking man-made versions of the law of lighting a fire, etc., then isn't it better to get there, and then we'll have a discussion about whether you did the right thing or not, than actually not get there. A similar thing was when I lived in Birmingham, in Coventry, our rabbi, in very orthodox setup of a synagogue, and people would come in for Yom Kippur, for Day of Atonement, and they often hadn't been for some time, and some women would be coming in, they'd be wearing a trouser suit. And there were mutterings and murmurings. And one chap actually complained very strongly to the rabbi that this lady who'd come in was actually not wearing appropriate clothing. And he said, have you seen her before? Have you met her? No. Said, oh, that's one new person in the synagogue today. Any more? So he got the guy to point out all the different people he hadn't seen. And the rabbi said, isn't that a good thing? That they've come along. Whatever they're wearing is another matter. We can discuss that. But actually, isn't it good to know that they've come? Did you welcome them? Were you saying, I'm glad you've been here? And that actually changed his attitude towards the situation. It's quite an interesting
I also wonder if Classroom RE is recognising the changes that Debbie has talked about in terms of diversity in the religion. So whether it is, for example, thinking about the position of LGBT Jews, whether it is recognising that Jews are looking different now. So some of us now in our families have got, because of marrying out the religion, we've got relatives who are black now, where we haven't had that before, or from Southeast Asia. So, and these children don't look like a stereotype of what a Jew looks like, but they are still Jewish because their mums are Jewish.
Yeah. It's definitely coming into the new specs. It's coming into the teaching that you were expected to deliver. That we understand that there are cultural differences even within the same religion, and that we should be able to make some identification of the differences. Now,
that's an interesting point, because we were sort of having a quick chat that if you ask me what faith I was, and I'd say I'm a Catholic, there's not much conversation to be had on that.
Not really.
But other Christians might call themselves a Baptist or a Methodist.
Yes.
But if you weren't a practicing Christian, you wouldn't define yourself as a Catholic, a Baptist or a Methodist. But what you guys are saying is that actually you're being honest, once a year, but you still define yourself as Jewish.
Absolutely.
And the customs and practices that come with that, the marriage, the death rituals, whether you go to synagogue or not, still. And I think for some of the students, like having to do this for GCSE for the first time, that's something that us as practitioners need to be confident in being able to address.
Yes, I think what you need to say, I think a clear difference comes from it being from the whole. Again, we come back up to this word history that in the this morning when in the panel on Islam, a couple of the panelists were saying was so important. And I think that the issue, though, for Christianity is that really, since the persecution of the Christians early on ended, Christians have been able to concentrate on doctrine. And on which type of doctrine they want, whether they want a reformed Christianity or whether they want to stay to something more the traditional. Whereas in Judaism, I think the whole notion of survival is extremely important. I mean, if you do bear in mind that it has been. I don't know who started referring to Judaism as being, or anti-Semitism rather, as the longest hatred. But certainly that's how it's referred to in the Imperial War Museum in the Holocaust wing. And I think that survival, I think the Holocaust, I think pride in survival. I mean, I think for me a very, very potent image is the March of the Living. I don't know if any of you know of the March of the Living, in which mainly hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish youngsters, and not only youngsters, and by youngsters I'm sort of talking about early 20s, and but others as well, descend on Auschwitz-Birkenau once a year, around about this time. It must be going on fairly soon, if not already. Last week. And I think a very powerful image of Jewish kids walking through, marching from this March of the Living culminates in a march from Auschwitz to Birkenau. And they're waving their Israeli flags and their Jewish flags, and it's this March of the Living. Look at us. You wanted shot of us, but we're here. And the point being about that is that actually when it comes then down to theology and practice and the uncomfortable issues of God on the Holocaust, which are as uncomfortable for Christians actually as they, in some ways more so really, that for many Jews becomes secondary to the sheer pride in survival and being able to stand there and saying, here I am. Do you know, here I am. And so that's why I think that you still have, and I teach lots of pupils actually whose parents or one parent has come down from a traditional Jewish family who's married out of the faith and so on, and now they're in the South London diaspora. But and they would still they proudly proclaim their Jewishness, and they do nothing, absolutely nothing, deliberately. I mean, clearly they don't go around murdering just because it says in the Ten Commandments don't. But they would never keep anything meaningfully. But they would still. So I think it's pride in survival against all the odds.
And wanting to make a difference. I think we do want to make a difference.
Yeah.
I think we are
and a positive difference.
Yeah,
a contribution.
We want to make a strong contribution, and I think we are big community people because community is so important to us.
Yes, I think so too.
We want to be involved in the community, and we want to make changes. And the very big movement, Mitzvah Day.
Yes.
I think that's very important for us. The importance of doing a mitzvah, of doing good deeds, commandments, good work. That's so central to us. So central to modern Jews, isn't it?
Definitely.
It's been said in the Torah where we have 613 different commandments. There's 365 positive, 248 negative. So every day you could do something different that you didn't do yesterday that is positive, which is rather an interesting thought.
Many of them are commandments which
commandments
don't
that you
actually
can't
exist
do
anymore.
anymore. Yes. But it's a good thought.
Yeah.
I would just add on what's been said earlier with regards to theology and God and not talking about it. It's always struck me throughout my life that God is something we don't really talk about, but that's okay. Like, there's the worrying, I don't know, what I'm going to say, I want you to take with a pinch of salt. The issue is, you've got this caricature of Pharisaic Judaism at the time of Jesus as being this rule-based, by the book, don't think about thought, don't think about emotions, don't think about thoughts, just implement the rules. And that's often a caricature that's been continued, and that is still what Judaism is, and it's not. But there is an element where Judaism is very focused on practice. Judaism is a very practical religion. There's practices around everything. Like if you go to the most orthodox end, there's a way to tie your shoelaces in the morning. Like you can find Judaism in every single practice. It really permeates everything. And God is much less important in that. So you do it because God said so, or because things have come from God originally. But Judaism builds up through the Talmudic writings and through rabbinic interpretations and rabbinic rulings and decrees that come from that. And a lot of it isn't necessarily God-centric.
Can I just build on that? Can I build on that for a minute? I'm not disagreeing with you in the least, but when you come a very large, the ultra-orthodox end of Judaism, at the ultra-orthodox end, there is a very influential. Well, the ultra-orthodox are known as the Haredim, but a large proportion of the Haredim are known as Hasidim. And if you have come up with the Hasidim, came out of Eastern Europe in the 17th century, and it was a theology which was a brand new theology that was based entirely on love for your fellow, on love for fellow man. And it was based entirely on love for your fellow Jew, and that God could be found in absolutely everything. God could be found in tying your shoelaces. God could be found in making a dental crown. God could be found in absolutely everything, and that therefore, on that basis, and this is what Hasidism is based on, is that God cannot only be found through studying rabbinical Judaism. God cannot only be found through studying Talmud in a yeshiva, in a rabbinical college. God can certainly not be found in a yeshiva if that study is a dry, dull regime. You only study Torah and Talmud if you derive the maximum joy that it should be bringing you closer to the deity. And on that basis, Hasidism is incredibly theocentric. But we, I think, down the line, have become much more practical in the bits of Judaism that we might practice. And so Abigail's quite right. There is, there is a way of doing everything. There is a way, and within ultra-orthodoxy, there is a problem that, in actual fact, you still might not be deemed. I can remember having a very interesting conversation with a former colleague of mine who was ultra-Orthodox, and he was writing resources on Judaism going back at the end of the last century. And he was saying that he was moving out of the Stamford Hill area. He was trying to get out of the Stamford Hill area of North London where he lived. He was trying to go to the Golders Green area. And the reason was that he found the degree, that it had become so nitpicking in his area that in actual fact, because the houses were all these sort of Victorian terraced houses, and they could all see into each other's gardens, and they could see each other's washing lines, and they could see whether they had Marks and Spencer's pyjamas, and Marks and Spencer's pyjamas were not regarded as being religious enough. They weren't fun, they weren't going back to what people would have been wearing in the 18th century enough. Even though the fabric was okay, the idea of the Marks and Spencers were not okay. Does that make because it was too modern. It was
Are we
too
sponsored by Marks and Spencers?
Yes, we're sponsored by Marks and Spencers. So this is a problem for them. So there are huge problems, I think, between the spirituality and the practice.
Yeah.
I think that there
I
is
also think, Debbie, there's a bit of a crossover going on as well, in that ideas that were mystical ideas,
Yes.
which
That's
like
right,
repair
that's right.
of the world, tikkun haolam,
are coming back.
which I never heard of when I was a child.
No, that's right.
But now that's become very, very central in reform. So the idea that the world has been damaged, that we need to gather the sparks together and create a better world, that is really coming to. So it's such a key idea in reform teaching, and yet that wasn't there before. And I think from the 1960s probably that has started filtering through into mainstream Judaism, and things like meditation, which some synagogues are looking into, the more sort of mystical things, Judaism through joy, through dance. That has all been coming from the Hasidic tradition.
You'll find, whether you're teaching GCSE or up to A level, you'll find there'll be quite a difference in the type of information that you're expected to give and the type of information that your pupils will expect to know. A lot of the questions that you've asked and the sort of depth into which we've gone, some of it will be very appropriate for your A-level students, and you should encourage them to find out more, to look for more information, whether it be on Chabad.org or Judaism 101 or many of these other places. Jewishlearning.com. Oh, yes. Okay. And you'll find that to a certain extent when you're doing GCSE, it will be getting more detailed than it used to be. You will find this a lot. You will find one of the biggest things you'll be looking for is, well, where does it say that? How do we know that information? And this is why I think it would be tremendously valuable for us as RE teachers to have more of an understanding of the religious texts themselves. You know that obviously it's always open to interpretation. Our whole idea of, what do we think as a panel, our individual, what we consider appropriate or interesting. At the same time, this all fits together in this jigsaw that is Judaism. Whichever.
You said in your previous session that you've come across some teachers of Christianity who teach Judaism as a sort of second-class religion because Christianity superseded it or replaced it. What advice might you be able to give to us? Because we've taught Judaism previously as Hinduism and Islam, but now it's going to be 25%. And I'm sure no teacher would want to come across in the sense of that one religion is more superior.
Yeah.
So what would be your advice maybe to Christian teachers or to Catholic teachers on how to get that balance and to give that across?
Okay, well, first of all, we need to establish that this is its own faith and it would exist whether Christianity existed or not, or whether any other religion exists or not, and that it has its own particular sort of existence because of that. There will be similarities, the idea of belief in one God, but then of course Christianity will talk about their Trinity and the way that they have a difference in that. And we would talk about the idea of a Messiah in a different way to, for example, Christianity. We might talk about the Messianic age, or the idea of...
That is on the syllabus.
Can I go in there a bit, really? Because, and this is not, I'm not speaking here to represent Judaism. All I can represent is myself and my friends and the experience that I have. I have not had in the whole of my life, and my whole of my life I have sustained a very strong Jewish social life and non-Jewish social life, but I've always had very close Jewish friends, and throughout my life I cannot remember one messianic conversation. I really cannot. So it's really important that the way that the figure of Jesus within Christianity, it's really only Hasidic Jews or Haredi Jews, but still that section, who are sitting on the edge of their chairs, desperate for Moshiach to come now. Because for the vast, overwhelming majority of Jews, the word Messiah does not... It's there, we sort of know it's there, but it's just sort of there, it's just, nobody really... nobody is focusing theologically in the nobody. That's not fair.
Well,
the word nobody is wrong.
Yeah.
But the overwhelming majority are not focusing on the coming of a Messiah. That isn't to say there isn't meant to be one. But by nature, Jews are practical people, not eschatological people. Do you know? You know. So it's the comparison is very is a difficult one because Christianity is so focused on the Messiah having come and the second coming. Do you know? You know. Whereas Judaism, I mean, seriously, quite seriously, I think if you did do the research, and you'd have many Jews scratching their head about what they're meant to believe
They
about
put
the
it in the
Messiah.
syllabus, the teaching
Yes.
of the Jewish
I know they
Messiah,
are,
yeah.
because it is. But it is.
Yes.
It is. That is eschatological hope. But when Jews, every Pesach, they say next year in Jerusalem, and what they mean by next year in Jerusalem is next year the Messiah will have come, who will have, you know, and we will all be reunited back in Jerusalem. They're not actually thinking that. They're just saying, cheers, next year in Jerusalem. Do you know, they're not actually thinking, we want the Messiah.
I think we're more interested in building
In
a
the
heaven.
now.
I think we're interested in the here and now,
that's
and
right.
building a heaven on earth. I think that's probably what we're more interested in.
That's right.
In through acts of loving kindness, through Hesed, which I spoke about
That's right.
before, we're trying to make the world a better place now. And I think some of us have concerns. If we think about, if the Messiah came and the third temple was
Yes.
built, that would be on the Dome of the Rock.
I know,
You know,
what happened to that?
we would.
And animal sacrifice.
matter.
Well, quite, and we're not into animal sacrifice and bloodbaths and things. So, we're more focused on how can we build a better life here? You know, what can we do?
It comes out of the teaching in the Tanakh in Ecclesiastes. And if you read Ecclesiastes, which says there is a time for, you know, a time for this and a time for that, a time to build and a time to break down, a time to... And then it goes on to say that life is a gift. I mean, in Judaism, life is the greatest gift
Choose life.
that God has given us. Therefore, that can go up into all kinds of issues of sort of things like abortion and euthanasia and so on. But life is the gift from God. And all that you know is that you have this life. And that what you should do with this to honour God is to make the very, very most of the life that you have. And the rest you leave to God.
Yeah,
You know,
it's in
there are
God's
things that it is
hands.
not for us to know and not for us to understand and not for us to take on board.
One thing that I would say there, so with 3FF, Three Faiths Forum, I go into schools and do the Encountering Faiths and Beliefs workshops a lot. And almost every time I go in, one of the kids will ask, what do you believe happens after death? And it's a really difficult question for me to answer because, like you've been saying, it's not something we think about. We focus on the here and now, and they always want to know, but what about heaven? Yeah, but what about hell? And it's really tricky because Judaism doesn't focus on the afterlife. It focuses on the life now because everyone knows the death is coming, but you have to do things before that happens in order to be a good Jew.
And that explains why our funerals can appear quite bleak, I think, compared to Christian funerals with a very plain coffin, very plain memorial stones. The emphasis is more on the living and how they continue rather than on the dead.
We
really.
also, as we mentioned this morning in the discussion on mourning, is to say that the mourner's prayer is not, oh, we're so sorry that this person's died. It's actually, God, how incredibly amazing you are, how remarkable it is that you are our creator, the world around us is here because of you. So it's putting the emphasis back on something greater and better. Considering the idea of the Messianic age or Messianic identity, this whole process, actually I think there's been possibly too much emphasis on, well, if Jews believe this about the Messiah, Christians believe that about the Messiah, because we have a different identification, we have a different way of seeing things, I think. We're looking at a way that we live that brings about the process of peace.
I think that's really important, actually. What you've just said is that it is a different way of looking at things. And so I think the greatest trap that you could fall into if you're teaching, let's say, Judaism and Christianity, is in actually trying to parallel it. Do you know? You know that,
Yeah.
and I think that's because it is a very, very different mindset. Do you see, you know, and I think that's what you need to try to get under. But the other thing to do, and you said, how do we, and Gerry mentioned, I think, all the websites, is that what many Jews do, if they want to know the answers, interestingly, they can't go to the text. And the reason they can't go to the text is because their Hebrew and their rabbinic knowledge isn't anywhere near good enough. And a little bit like in Islam, I mean, in the religion classes, that Jews we're taught to how to read the Hebrew, but in the time that we have available a week, we're not taught it as a language and to understand it because we don't have the time to do that. And so Jews don't have the facility to go to the text in quite the same way. So what they have to do, which is very, very important about Judaism, going right back to Mount Sinai, is the oral tradition.
Yes.
And the oral tradition that God said to Moses, this is the written law, but this is how they're to do it. And he passed that on, and the rabbis passed that on, so the honest answer is you ask the rabbi. And you can do that through the website. So use the website, not just for information, but to ask. Do you see what I mean? You know, because that is entirely the Jewish tradition of asking.
I was just going to make an observation. So I know we both teach at Catholic schools, but that is a real danger for some of what we've been told by other people that we are teaching. We're going to teach Judaism because it complements more Christian beliefs. So it will help them to understand other beliefs, and that's really hard if you're not leading a department to make sure that every teacher is making sure that they're teaching it as separate religion or a discrete religion.
It's very
they do
difficult.
have some kind of relationship.
But they do sit together beautifully. They do.
It's the way it's taught, I suppose. From some teachers' point of view, it will help them because it's pretty much the same, and it's
Yes. There are aspects of similarity, and you can turn round and see Jesus at the Last Supper doing certain things, and you could relate it to what we do at Passover, but it doesn't mean to say that they're synchronetic and they fit together perfectly. Otherwise, we would all believe the same thing exactly. And obviously that doesn't happen. But there are
they
some
do
things.
naturally. They do. I think they do naturally complement each other. I
Can
think
we get to,
they do complement each other because so much does come from. I mean, certainly baptism, Holy Communion, beliefs in resurrection. Yeah. That all comes from Judaism.
There are many things that help us to understand each other's faiths, but I think we have to be aware that we are teaching some different religions that may benefit from each other's knowledge, but they are separate and distinct. You wanted to?
Just to stay with that point,
yes.
I think that the way they've designed the annexes of various religions have made it very clear that the linear and smart, they're all the same.
Yes.
Here's a rite of passage, confirmation equals bar mitzvah or whatever. That's all been debunked, and I actually think that the way that the annexes have been set up will help teachers make distinctions between certain Christianity and Judaism. I think that's quite well made quite distinctive, and I'm sure everybody in this room can take on board this notion of the argument for the sake of heaven, the idea that it is an oral tradition is very strong in Judaism. I don't know if Anya's got the same worry I would have, which is in an exam, 25 to a quarter of their time between 15 and 16 is going to be spent looking at Judaism and trying to describe it as an outsider, let's say. And the problem is, to what extent could I get a mark? Get it down to mark.
For making a quick comparison or trying to change a keyword.
Evaluate, with a reference to sources of authority, etc. And if I was to say, I think Messiah's probably a good one because you could say there's a whole spectrum of beliefs in relation to Messiah.
Yes.
But I can understand the Martian argument that if you get a clear picture of even an ultra-orthodox situation, it's then much easier to, against that...
Yes, it is. It's much easier. Because it's far less nuanced. It's much clearer. That's right.
And I'm just kind of wondering if you were examiners and one of Anya's kids was sent in an essay, would you give marks for... Well, there are some Jews who are just culturally, ethnically Jews, or have an approach which comes through a commitment that they found in life? That sounds awful to say getting down to marks.
You can, well, obviously.
Yes, I would. Yes, I would.
Yes.
Yes, I would.
And depending on the type of question that's being asked, if it is relevant to the response, yes, you mark the relevant answer and you say, well done, that's great, that's what we need to read.
I'm doing this. I teach. I have been teaching for the last donkey's years the AQA syllabus A, Judaism full course, and Christian ethics. That's what I've been doing. And they don't have 12-mark questions at AQA. They've had 6. They do probably now. They do, but they have 6-mark questions. And I have tried to, time and time again, I'm trying to. This is hence my outstretched arms, because I'm trying to get them to understand what would be valid responses, and this cultural, even totally secular response is as valid a response as that is. And in fact, some would say more, because this is more part of British society and British values and British, this is than that is. Do you know?
Just to come back at you on that, just remind me of that picture of Moses with the red.
I know, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you won't get the whole Jewish community across unless you've got that.
No, absolutely.
If you think that typically the kind of exam information we're looking at is, we used to talk about religion and life, religion and society. The answers that we're expecting our pupils to give must have a relation to the society that they live in and the life they're leading, or the life that is led by practitioners of that faith, no matter whether they are, pork on Sunday and whatever.
I think to answer your question in terms of marks, the way that I teach is that I'm never happy with my candidates saying some Jews and other
specific.
Jews. I really don't like that at all. And
I
would say, a secular Jew would say that, so although this would be extremely important to a Haredi Jew, a secular Jew would think that. A Jew living in Israel would think this. Do you know, and so they're actually, so therefore they are all valid.
Thank you. We're pretty well at the end of our time, but obviously you can contact us for other information or for other discussion points. But I think one of the biggest things is to say, within the faith, there is such a diversity. Your pupils do need to know that you can't just say, if you're talking about a Jew, you're not talking about every Jew.
Yeah.
The advantage of that is that you can have a wider response so long as you know what you're talking about. And obviously the great thing is to be able to continue this conversation with members of the Jewish community, find out other things, pick up the Jewish Chronicle and things like that from time to time, the Jewish news.
That's really
it's
good
great
advice.
to see, because you have such a diversity. Look at information on the internet, and it is very handy to have, particularly as you have the opportunity to ask the rabbi.
Do get the Jewish Chronicle, because one of the things that you'll notice in something that I think is a fantastic thing to notice in the Jewish Chronicle from a teacher's point of view, is that if you look at it one week and then you get the next week's edition and you look at the letters page, then you see, because they're always taking issue. They're taking issue with each other, because that is the Jewish community. That's what we do. Do you know?
And there's a very good article in there. It's called "Rabbi, I Have a Problem."
And
an Orthodox rabbi will address a problem,
and
then a progressive rabbi, and you have it. It's perfect, really.
It is absolutely, and you can get it if you sign up. If you subscribe for a year, you can get online. You can get a good bargain discount.
Yeah, we're also sponsored by the Jewish Chronicle and Marks and Spencer's.
One thing I would say on Jewish newspapers is, if you pick up the London Jewish News, take the Ask the Rabbi column with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, that's quite right wing.
Oh, really?
With a word he says.
Don't know anything about it.
It's more.
It's Rabbi Schechter.
Right, yes, it's quite right wing.
Yeah. So obviously there's all sorts of other ways. There's tweets. There's
and the other thing to do, if you're in the London area, which I've been doing now since about 1986, is that the Board of Deputies British Jews run, and their education department, which is headed by Sarah Perlmutter, they run great days trips for kids. They will put it together for you. They will put together the trip that you want. So for GCSE, what I've been doing for a long time is that we start at a Jewish cemetery. We move on to an Orthodox synagogue. For me, I always do it at the end, around about this time of year, so that it's revision after the 2 years. So they'll move on to an Orthodox synagogue where they'll do different workshops, reminding them of Shabbat and Kashrut and all these kind of things. And then we have a kosher lunch. And then in the afternoon we do the kosher shops, because that's what I want to see, the shopping with the hechshers, the marks on the... and they go into a bookshop and they see Talmud and they see mezuzahs, and they can see all the artefacts in the shops, and they can do some shopping themselves. But they also do things like survivor talks. They will take you to the Jewish Museum up in Camden if you would.
Yes.
So the Board of Deputies will do this. I mean, it doesn't come... they don't. There's no admin fee. There's a fee for the trip in terms of the lunch. Do you know that you're paying, and it's a kosher lunch because the kids can't take non-kosher food into any kosher establishment. So there is. So I'm afraid that it doesn't come. It isn't a cheap day, but it's a fact that our kids in my school. I'm in an independent school, and they go on lots of trips. But they say it's a fact. They love this trip. They think it's well worth considering.
You've mentioned the Jewish Museum. I would suggest that you contact them. They do some great stuff, and they do, particularly if your school is in London, they do some very good,
Workshops.
very low-cost workshops. But also Holocaust Education Trust. If you haven't got involved in there, please, I would suggest that you do get involved. Their training is magnificent, and they take it from all sorts of walks of life. They provide a lot of things, so have just those two other things. I know you mentioned Camden, but it's well worth it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.